Hello, everybody. I am joining you in just a moment. Coming in with a book and what's left of a cup of coffee. And are you ready for story time? Are we all ready for stories? We're going to hear more about San Francisco. Oh, I forgot to put up my sound wall here. It's not a sound wall, but excuse me for a moment. Come on in. The water's fine. We're going to be reading today another chapter from the books of my grandfather, Tro Harper. This book is called Nowhere Except San Francisco, Memoirs of a Resident Tourist. Yesterday we read about cable car capers, learned all sorts of things about cable cars and how they work and some history, terrible accidents, and some mishaps and a lot of fun, including an ice cream cone. Yeah, that's awesome. So let's see, I might check and make sure. Let me check here. See if I am getting out to the world. Hello, hello, hello. Do, 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 do. I am broadcasting live. Yay! Twitter let me know that it's working. You want to hear some stories? Let's hear about San Francisco, the history of San Francisco by Tro Harper. This chapter is more of just a page. There's gold in them thar hills. Eventually, everyone in the world knew about the California gold rush. But when the discovery of gold by James Marshall in January of 1848 was published in the local press, the story amounted to a mere 68 words. After all, the nugget was about the size of a dime, yet the lucky strike turned out to be one of the signal events of the century. The headline read, "Gold Mine Found in the newly made raceway of the Sawmill recently erected by Captain Sutter on the American Fork. Gold has been found in considerable quantities. One person brought $30 worth to New Helvetia, gathered there in short time. California, no doubt, is rich in mineral wealth. Great chances here for scientific capitalists. Gold has been found in almost every part of the country." Moving on to the hero of Fisherman's Wharf. Oh, let me get in there. The hero of Fisherman's Wharf. Breathes there a gourmand with taste buds so dead as to turn up a nose at an offer of cracked crab? A doubtful proposition. In the city's restaurants, a whole cracked crab for lunch or a crab cocktail for a starter, or just the thought of a crab Louis salad accompanied by a plateful of sourdough French bread and slabs of butter has produced anticipatory delights unknown to ordinary mortals. But to get the full flavor of cracked crab, you must stand in the salt-laden breeze at Fisherman's Wharf as you scoop up tender morsels dredged from a tangy cocktail sauce with a wooden spatula. A paper cup is your Minton china, a wooden spoon your sterling flatware. Enveloped in clouds of steam from the crab pots along the sidewalk, with aproned attendants either ladling out boiled crabs or cracking open freshly cooked ones, out-of-towners are enchanted. Animal rights folk recoil in dismay as they witness wriggling crabs disappear into the boiling water while gourmets present smack their lips in anticipation of such piscatorial delights. One day, while gobbling up some sand dabs at Swan's Oyster Depot out on Polk Street, I got into a discussion with the guy on the stool next to me about cracked crab and whether it was going the way of all the good things that make San Francisco such a delight. He assured me Cracked crab was more or less here to stay and was not, even if wholesalers had to ship it in from Crescent City, about to disappear from menus or memory. But he did think the local fishermen were rapidly being replaced by Vietnamese fishermen, who were about the only people around willing to fight the sea and suffer outrageous price structures quoted by mendacious wholesalers. On the way back to my bookshop, I felt someone ought to write about the imminent fate of cracked crab. That someone turned out to be me. Sometime back, while digging in the San Francisco room at the SF Public Library for a story about Fisherman's Wharf, I several times ran into references about a Lorenzo Maniscalco, the most legendary of legendary crab fishermen ever to battle the wind and sea off the Golden Gate. The Crab Fishermen's Association named him Il Campione, the champion, king of the crab fishermen, back in the 1920s. There were little snatches of information in isolated pamphlets and booklets that extol his heroism, fortitude, and daring do, but trying to find a first-hand account seemed almost impossible. It was one of those stories that haunt a researcher, and it was not until I had retired and moved to Santa Rosa that I happened on a mother-lode of information about Lorenzo and his family. My barber is an ex-San Franciscan who ran a shop in the Marina District for years. Since that part of town is a regular fish stew of people of Italian descent, one day I asked him if he had ever heard of a crab fisherman by the name of Lorenzo Maniscalco. "Are you kidding me?" "No, I'm not kidding you. Why do you ask? I just want to know if you know a Lorenzo Maniscalco." "He was my father." "Now who's kidding who?" "Didn't you know my last name was Maniscalco?" "Somehow you've always just been John." And we both broke out laughing. Talk about serendipity. Who would ever connect a barbershop with a crab fishing? My reasoning was that if I knew my barber's name was John and his telephone number, I had enough information to make an appointment and get a haircut. So it was a genuine surprise when I stumbled into a first-hand account of Lorenzo Maniscalco, the classic example of a man who was born into this world to demonstrate what it means to start with nothing except an indomitable spirit and wind up a champion. In 1894, together with his brother, 2 sisters, and his mother, Lorenzo sailed from Sicily. He had no skills, no trade, no education. He was 14 years old. He never did learn to read or write, but when he died, he had the admiration and love of 12 children, 26 grandchildren, a dedicated wife, a bank account, stocks and bonds, a 3-story house in the Marina District, friends all over the city, and a sound and seaworthy fishing boat named the San Cristoforo. Besides John, the barber, there is also a priest, Dr. Joe, a chiropractor, a nun, a pharmacist, and another brother in Santa Rosa, Lou, who worked most of his life as one of the partners in the Royal Baking Company in San Francisco. After Lou sold his interest in the bakery, he became a salesman for the Laraburu Bakery in San Francisco. Lou's son is an administrator at Memorial Hospital in Santa Rosa. It's Lou who is the current custodian of the gold medal, inscribed Il Campione, and presented to Lorenzo as a tribute to his long and heroic life as a crab fisherman. 2 grandsons are commercial airline pilots. Among the other grandchildren are a nurse, a lawyer, a policeman, and a school teacher. Today, we have astronauts who are not afraid to sit on top of a rocket, possessors of the right stuff. Throughout history, there have been sailors who filled their sails with wind and steered into whitecaps, bucking not only heavy seas, but also chance. Lorenzo was sort of a combination of the two. Had he thought about it, he might have paused, but instead, he just did what he felt he had to do to maintain his self-respect, feed and clothe his family, pay his bills, and maintain his reputation among his friends. If ever a man possessed the pioneer spirit, it was Lorenzo. Possessed it in spades. He learned to fish when he was 15 years old, and although he didn't know it at the time, he was going to be the sole support of his family for a number of years, a breadwinner without either age or experience. But it was not unnatural, since he came from a family of fishermen. As far back as anyone could remember, Maniscalos had been fishers of the Mediterranean Sea. First coral fishermen, then working from Sicily to the Dardanelles in search of bottom or rockfish, it never occurred to any of the residents of Sciaccia there was any other way of life. When the men of the family went to sea for 2 or 3 months at a time, often ranging as far at sea as Tunis, their families regarded these extended absences as a normal way of life. By the time Lorenzo was born, his father had experienced most of the perils of winds, waves, and fear. On stormy evenings in San Francisco, Lorenzo often told his children how their grandfather built a new boat, took it out for a trial run. The next day, he set to sea, never to return. Lorenzo first heard of San Francisco from a relative who had visited the Bay Area as a sailor in the Italian Navy. He described the early morning fogs, the bright, bright sunlight of noontime, the vastness of the bay, descriptions that polished the city to such a brilliance his listeners felt it must be a branch of heaven. But only a few possessed the courage and energy to displace themselves from Europe and made the trip. Sciaccians were few at first, but by the time letters home related the wonders of the fabulous city beyond the horizon, migration began in earnest. Most of these seekers for a better life first landed on Ellis Island in New York Harbor, but the goal, of course, was always San Francisco. When Lorenzo finally got to San Francisco, he had already spent a year in Boston, working at whatever an employer would trust to a 14-year-old boy. So it was with a good deal of joy when his family packed up and entrained for the West. Once on the shores of San Francisco Bay, Lorenzo met up with an old Spaniard who fished for rock cod off the Marin shores. El Patron taught him how to scale and gut a fish, how to mend nets, how to read charts, how to cut a fish hook out of his hand, how to crate crabs, and how to tie all kinds of knots, bends, hitches, and splices. He also got a liberal education in the location of where all the landmarks, bell buoys, horns, and whistles and lights were and what their individual messages meant to mariners. Since there was a regular colony of people from Sciaccia, he was never lonely, never went without support and encouragement. People arrived almost every week, and included the names of DiMaggio, Alioto, La Rocca, Gilardia, Scafani, and Napoli. Afternoons, Lorenzo would listen to the older men as they sat around Fisherman's Wharf, mending nets and smoking cigars that looked like twisted, burned rope and smelled the same. Oddly, though his friends and neighbors loved the black cigar tobacco, Lorenzo never had any desire to smoke. He was content to sit with his friends and listen as the fishermen harangued the fates that produced such idiots as those who ran City Hall. As the friendship between the boy and the old Spaniard grew, so did Lorenzo's knowledge of the sea and its unpredictable and erratic habits. Each day in the early morning light, as the voyage out the gate began, Lorenzo would carefully watch the motion of the waves as the two fishermen cruised toward Point Bonita, just outside the narrow passage, then as now called the Golden Gate. This entrance to the inner bay is known as the Potato Patch. Here, the eddies and swirls of the outflowing tide jostle the incoming waves and produce a water dance that resembles drops of water bouncing around on a hot griddle. Outside the gate, the watch began for rogue waves, huge rollers cresting and boiling from out of nowhere. 1 minute, the sea was its usual self, then chaos. An unwary mariner could find both himself and his boat enveloped, shoved toward the sky, only to plunge the next second into a deep trough, a 30-foot wallowing wall of water that churned the boat toward the shore. No matter how experienced, fishermen could never plan the arrival of these waves from hell. They just appeared and were gone, sometimes taking lives with them. By the time Lorenzo was 18, restless and impatient, he felt he had learned enough to buy his own boat and go it alone. He went to his mother and asked her to advance him the money. Aside from the loan, he also got much advice and counsel from the gang that hung around Fisherman's Wharf. The old-timers could carry on for hours about the lore surrounding crab boats. Although he hated the taste of coffee, he would nurse a cup and listen. Most of his compatriots in the fishing business spent long hours, and still do, swilling some of the strongest coffee this side of Italy. If you want to talk to a fisherman today, you have to meet him in the restaurant next door to the Crab Fishermen's Association, where in the early morning hours there's always a crowd, although most of the customers uniformly condemn the coffee. He learned that while the clipper bow appeared to be the favorite, other advisors defended the square bow and open cockpit, but there was no doubt anyone who wanted a reliable engine would buy a Hicks, a one-lunger that even today beats a reassuring bang, chug, 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 as the boats slide into Fisherman's Wharf. A Genoese named Basiccia Bevilacqua, a Monterey builder, constructed many of the boats that sail the bay today. The others come from almost anywhere, but the indomitable Hicks engine powers them all. The boat Lorenzo bought was a little beauty, and he promptly named her San Cristoforo, after the patron saint of travelers. Although the Catholic Church no longer recognizes St. Christopher as the saint who rode the Christ child across a river, Lorenzo believed firmly in tradition. From the beginning, he felt intuitively that somehow he was under the protection of the Almighty, that he was destined to succeed, blessed as it were. So it didn't matter how high the waves, how strong the winds, or how contrary the tides, he would always come back to port with a load of fish. Somehow, he knew the San Cristoforo was his lucky talisman. Coincident with the purchase of his first boat, commercial fishermen had discovered the floor of the bay was crawling with crabs. Since 1888, the catch had grown to over 5 million pounds in the year 1904, and that didn't include females, since laws passed in 1897 forbade taking them. In 1915, the catch had grown so large the Department of Fish and Game placed a limit on the size, which meant you had to throw back those that measured under 7 inches across the shell. Lorenzo didn't really care one way or the other, since at that time crab fishing was not the only thing occupying his mind. There was a young girl from Ciaccia. Her name was Maria Catharina Scafani, and she was just 23 when she and Lorenzo were married in St. Peter and Paul Church in North Beach, opposite Washington Square Park, a small plot of greenery that is still a gathering place for people of Italian descent. By the time the two young people pledged to love, honor, and obey, Lorenzo had put aside enough money from his fishing to buy a house on North Point Street within walking distance of Fisherman's Wharf. It was necessary to live close to his work, since there was not much transportation available at 2 o'clock in the morning when he got up to prepare his boat for the day's fishing. During crab season in Northern California waters, the weather can be downright... During crab season in Northern California waters, the weather can be downright discouraging, especially at 2 o'clock in the morning, when it would be cold, probably foggy, and a wind straight off the ocean. As he trudged out the door of his house on North Point Street, on the way to the wharf, bending his head into the stiff breezes that buffet the early risers in San Francisco, he would be wearing a beat-up fedora hat, long johns underwear, a pair of nondescript pants, a woolen shirt, and if the weather was bad, a jacket of some sort. Under his arm was a loaf of Italian French bread, some salami, cold cuts or cheese, and always a gallon jug of wine. Even when the weather was dreariest, he never wore oilskins, claiming their stiffness prevented him setting his ring nets quickly. If it rained, he kept right on baiting hoops and tossing them into the swirling waves. At sea, he would bow to the custom of wearing a rubber apron, not so much so he wouldn't get wet, but to keep the inevitable slime that came up with the crabs from permeating his clothes. The first few weeks of November are ideal for crab fishing. Mist muffles San Francisco Bay, and at night you can lie in bed and hear the bell buoys clanging out their lonesome warnings. Each foghorn has a distinctive blast and cadence that tells the mariner not only where it is, but how far away it is. Almanacs relate that there are at least 3 days of dense fog during November, but this is the time for crabs and crab fishermen. The crabs have finished their molting season, as the ichthyologists call it, when they shed the old shell and put on the new, allowing them to fill themselves out with luscious meat, and are practically asking to be caught. By the end of November, the first of the winter rains, cold and driving, crashed down from the Gulf of Alaska and last for days on end. Toward the end of June, fishermen are not only worn out by the constant struggle with the sea, the catch has also dwindled. So about half the men tie up, stack their traps and nets, and get ready to go to Alaska for the summer. But that sort of life was not for Lorenzo. When the crab season was at an end, he went out for salmon, rock cod, and other bottom fish. There was also a ready market for sea urchins. As his success grew, children began to appear with great regularity, eventually 12 in all. He didn't take his responsibilities lightly. There were mortgage payments on the house in North Point, but they didn't become onerous until his wife decided there simply wasn't enough room where they were living, and besides, she had found a wonderful big house out on the edge of the Marina District. It wasn't as convenient to the Wharf as North Point, but it could hold all the family. The new house on Francisco between Franklin and Goff had been built on a 50 by 100-foot lot, a real bonanza in San Francisco, since most of the houses are on 25-foot lots. The big 3-story house filled the 50-foot frontage to capacity, and the Maniscalos filled the house, also to capacity. My most persistent memory of the marina is the common sight of the crabmen who lived in the same neighborhood with their gear, traps, nets, floats, and so on, stretched out along the sidewalks to make it easy to identify problems and stitch up the holes in the webbing. Lorenzo's chiropractor son, Dr. Joe, remembers the big backyard filled with the yellow and red buoys distinctive to Lorenzo, plus the piles of crab traps, fish nets, and other gear. Today, the house is gone, supplanted by condominiums, and everyone in the neighborhood from the old days is clucking the shame of it all. There are 2 kinds of crab fishermen, those who know where crabs are abundant, but where it is too dangerous to fish, and those who follow the fleet and take their chances on turning up enough catch to make a living. Lorenzo was one of the first variety. Although he understood the ocean bottom off the Golden Gate like the inside of his fedora hat, he also appreciated there was no place to drop the traps like the sandy bottom off Ocean Beach. Between the Cliff House and Half Moon Bay, the crab patch stretches on for miles. Just outside the line of breakers pounding on the sand is one of the most fertile crab fisheries in all Northern California. But no one was then, or is now, daring enough to brave the danger of being capsized and tumbled in the surf. Except Lorenzo. He knew that along that sweep of shoreline were some of the trickiest tides and undertows on the entire Pacific coast. There are signs along the beaches that warn swimmers to beware of undertow. Despite these indications of potential disasters, Lorenzo fished without fear or restraint. Each night he returned to port with bountiful catches, more than any other fisherman at the wharf. It was dangerous work. To stay alive, care and watchfulness were a constant. Many times he was the only boat at sea, and of course, he was alone on his boat. Riches were fine, if you are alive to enjoy them. Since Lorenzo was always by himself, he had to be particularly agile in setting his ring nets. These contraptions were, and still are, about 3 feet in diameter, made of wire mesh netting. At the bottom of the net, there is a spot for fixing the bait in place. Sometimes frozen sardines are the bait of choice, but herring or squid, which nowadays is the most popular bait, are also used. Squid, sold in restaurants as calamari, is sometimes called poor man's abalone. Ring nets are attached to some 25 feet of line and are tossed over in about 18 to 20 feet of water. The distance between the floating buoys is determined by how fast a fisherman can haul up his catch, empty the net, rebait it, and toss it out over again. The number of nets any fisherman can handle is also determined by how much stamina he has. Lorenzo felt comfortable using somewhere between 30 and 35 nets. Working the ocean beach for crab is definitely not for the faint of heart. Back in olden days, say around 1939 or 40, tourists used to be fascinated by the sight of fishermen on the sidewalks and streets around Fisherman's Wharf with their nets laid out in a vast landscape of tangled ropes, cords, floats, and other gear, repairing and painting whatever needed such work. As the men jabbered away in Italian, the visitors snapped pictures. There is probably no occupation that demands such attention to detail as that of the deep-sea fisherman. By the nature of the work and the education of experience, the deck of a fishing boat must be cleared of stray gear, since once a crab fisherman begins to bait the hoop nets, untangle the lines that keep the buoys from drifting and tossing them overboard, he needs all the space the boat can afford. Ship shape is a term with hidden overtones. I'm going to take a quick break. Where'd my water? Oh, my water's way over there. Coffee's an easier reach. I can reach that. Coffee, good for the vocal cords when you're reading. You enjoying the story about the fisherman, Lorenzo, so far? Somebody. Oh, I hope that Kai got that. I'm not paying attention. La 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 la. I'm just gonna check this. Oh, good, I am on. I'm just gonna check this. Woohoo, I'm on. That's exciting. It's good to know when you're on or when you're not on. All right, let's get back to the reading, shall we? My son has a friend who is outside, so hopefully that is taken care of with the dad and the son. I'm not involved. I'm down here reading with you. We're going to finish our story. 1, 2, oh, we're almost done with the chapter. Almost done for the day. Okay, ship shape is a term with hidden overtones. That's where I left it, isn't there? Didn't I? Lorenzo's favorite fishery was off the spot opposite the old Fleischhacker pool at Ocean Beach. Either for protection or because of the ample supplies of food, the crabs clustered around this spot. As John, my barber, told me, he used to drive out to the beach after school to watch his father fish, and at times felt very uneasy as the San Cristoforo rode to the top of one wave and then totally disappeared into the trough behind it, emerging again on the next rise. While all this was going on, of course, Lorenzo had to keep the eyes in the back of his head constantly on the lookout for that oddball wave that might end the day in tragedy. Twice he got caught. The first time, that's my cat knocking the camera. The first time he failed Can you hear me? Can you hear me in the back? Audio, are you working? There we go, audio. Okay, so hopefully the audio isn't a mess right now. Maybe I can listen to it. Meow, meow. Stella, you certainly are attentive right now. Yeah. You certainly are attentive right now. You certainly are attentive right now. We're going to stop that little loop from continuing. Come here, Stella. Do you want to come up here? Come on. There you go. Hi, Stella. Yeah, so much purring. Oh, my cat wants attention. We're almost to the end of the chapter. Why do you... Yes? Yes? Come here. You want to come here? There we go. This is Stella. Say hello, Stella. We're going to finish reading now, okay? You ready to finish reading? Yay. Hi, honey. Oh, somebody needs attention, huh? It's all the fish talk, isn't it? You hear the fish talk and you say, I like fish. I like fish. Okay, so we left Lorenzo with water boiling into every open space on the deck. He managed to hang onto a rail as the boat filled and got lower and lower in the water. Now waves pounded over him as the boat slid into the trough between the breakers. Water floated the drifting crab boxes and swirled into his cabin and hold. The beach and disaster lay only a couple of 100 yards away. With each descent into the maelstrom of breaking water, he fought to preserve both his balance and his courage. Suddenly, the boat sidewinded and capsized. Lorenzo clung for his life to the overturned vessel. Fortunately, a passing fisherman saw what happened. In peril of his life, the fisherman, fighting his own battle with the seas, managed to get close enough to throw a line to the struggling Lorenzo. Half clinging, half swimming, Lorenzo got the line wound around a cleat on the deck. There was still enough air in the boat to keep it afloat. If they could just work it past the breaker line. Slowly and deliberately, the two men did get the San Cristoforo into deeper water, where eventually, and with the help of many others, it was righted and pumped out. The second time the sea caught him, Lorenzo was not so lucky. He had been busy hauling and baiting nets in the early afternoon when suddenly a wave swished in from nowhere and tumbled the boat over and over. Once again, a fisherman on his way to somewhere else saw the accident, panicked, and headed for home, terrified that if he went to help, his boat might suffer the same catastrophe. At length, the pathetic sight of Lorenzo awash in the sea, clinging for his life to the overturned craft, so moved the other man, he returned and got as close as he dared and begged the drenched and half-frozen Lorenzo to give it up and come aboard. This Lorenzo refused to do. In the midst of this maritime bedlam, an Italian shouting match erupted. Threats and imprecations were stifled by the roaring surf as Lorenzo tried to convince his would-be rescuer to put a line on the San Cristoforo and tow it to safety. But the other man answered these suggestions with curses. The two boats were drifting toward the beach. A sudden wave broke Lorenzo's hold on his boat, and he was forced to clamber onto the rescue boat, still yelling his head off. Both men watched the San Cristoforo as she smashed to driftwood on the sand and rocks. Both accidents were a miserable experience. To witness the sea pouring in on his deck, watch the catch swept overboard, and various expensive pieces of tackle disappear into the swirling combers were bad enough, but rolling in the surf with either the heavy boat or the cold waves ever ready to destroy him, Lorenzo nevertheless survived. When he got home, he discovered he had a broken arm. Fortunately, by this time in his life, Lorenzo had money in the Bank of America. His friend A.P. Gianni, founder of the Bank of America, had advised him to save and invest, not only in the Bank of America and Transamerica stock, but also to maintain a substantial amount of cash on hand. So it wasn't long before another San Cristoforo bobbed and weaved through the Golden Gate and headed due south for Ocean Beach. If you were to reach for your dictionary, you might find the word intrepid. But it would be inadequate to describe the courage, determination, resolve, valor, and fortitude that made Lorenzo who he was. A 5 foot 6 inches, heavily muscled man with huge legs and a thick torso. His friends and neighbors called him Il Ferro, Iron Man. The handling of crabs dockside at Fisherman's Wharf is always a sideshow worth watching. As a tourist attraction, it ranks right up there with cable cars and hilltops if you are fortunate to be on hand, like early afternoon. At dockside, the crabs are offloaded from the deck into a large box lashed to the pilings of the pier. If the California Shellfish Company doesn't pick them up until the next day, the crabs still are in salt water. In Lorenzo's time, the California Shellfish Company was a frantic scene. Huge pots of boiling water, belching steam into the air, women in white coats and rubber aprons, bandanas tied around their heads, banging crab bodies on the steel tables to crack the shells and loosen the meat inside. One afternoon a few years back, while I was poking around among the back alleys at Fisherman's Wharf, I counted... Oh! That was my cat falling! How are you? That must have hurt. You hit the table with your head. Are you okay, Stella? Oh, I was in the middle of a nice story. My cat is in the middle of everything. You are clumsy. Oh, you don't want that? Are you okay? Are you okay? You gonna have a concussion now? You hit your head pretty hard. Yeah, sit down and lick yourself. Get your bearings. How can I tell if you have a concussion? Cat. All right. Oh, sweetie. You are needing attention for some reason. Wow, it's not dinner time yet. Yeah, go away. Stop bothering me, cat. I love you. Okay. All right. Back to the story, which we're almost done with. We had bandanas tied around their heads, banging crab bodies on the steel tables to crack the shells and loosen the meat inside. One afternoon a few years back, while I was poking around among the back alleys at Fisherman's Wharf, I counted 23 women at work in the shambles of a shed. I watched as the women picked the shells clean and tossed them onto the wet concrete floor. One man, whose job it was, shoveled them into big boxes and took them outside and loaded them into the garbage bins. Seagulls, by the thousands, hovered overhead and then clustered around the discarded shells like Market Street commuters ready to pounce on the nearest streetcar or bus. Screeching at one another, or in no one in particular, seagulls could be heard for 2 blocks in any direction. After the gulls had worked over the shell pile, there was little or no offal left for the garbage men. I was told that from 5,000 to 6,000 pounds of meat was canned and shipped every day to markets, grocery stores, hotels, and restaurants. Outside, high on the wall in front of the place, was an orange and black sign that read, "Stay slim, have vim, eat fish." When Lorenzo got into his 70s, his wife put her foot down and told him he could get used to going to church. His Sundays at sea were about to be a thing of the past. With one exception. Occasionally after church, the whole family would get in the boat and go for a picnic at Strawberry Point. Church came first, however. As a rule, the family en masse swarmed into the rotunda of St. Peter and Paul, led by the father, properly attired in stiff collar and white shirt with a neatly tied necktie. When the Maniscallos marched in, the congregation greeted them with gasps of wonder. The mother, in a pretty frock plus hat and white gloves, led the 12 children stepping along in single file. Before they left home, the family had all passed inspection. The boys in stiff white collar shirts and white ties, the girls in carefully ironed and starched dresses, plus meticulously combed hair, were objects of wonder. How could a woman do that with 12 kids? It was a majestic performance and never failed to arouse due amazement and proper respect. Lorenzo loved his friends, his family, his city, and his country. He loved having people around him, so on days when no picnic was scheduled after church, Lorenzo would invite neighbors, and that included most of North Beach, to come over to the house for dinner. It was an invitation issued despite Mrs. Maniscalco's built-in dinner party consisting of 12 children. By nature, he was a gregarious, happy man who loved having lots of people around him to share whatever the family had in the larder. Almost all the family gathered at dinner time. Mrs. Maniscalco prided herself on her cooking and always loaded the table with soup, a meatloaf, or a steak or a roast, and serving dishes filled with vegetables of the season. One day I asked John if his father ever got sick, and he told me he was rarely out of action. The only time he failed to go to sea was when the San Cristoforo capsized. At another point, he was pruning a tree in the backyard at his home and fell to the ground. On October 24th, 1973, Lorenzo died at the age of 93 and was buried from the lifelong church of most Americans of Italian descent in San Francisco, St. Peter and Paul in North Beach. 3 years later, in 1976, Mary, as she had been known to all her friends and family, now aged 89, died on October 25th. Often you hear visitors to San Francisco speculating on what makes San Francisco such a different city. Well, one of the reasons is people like Lorenzo Maniscalco. Lorenzo and his countrymen are perfect examples of the truth of the Latin legend embedded in the Great Seal of the United States. E pluribus unum. From many, one. And then there is a little poem at the end, a little saying at the end of the chapter that says, "You freeze in August, roast in September, but SF is cool. Always remember." I love it. I love it. I love it. Okay. So that is the end of our reading of story time from my grandfather's book, Nowhere Except San Francisco, Memoirs of a Resident Tourist. His name was Tro Harper. He lived in San Francisco as a bookseller for many decades and then wrote several books about the city and the people that he knew there. And this is one of his books. And I'm enjoying reading it, and I'm going to continue reading. I think I said daily at 3 p.m. We'll see if I do it over the weekend. I like having days off to really relax. But for sure, Monday through Friday, 3 p.m., I'm going to keep reading these books until they're done. And I hope that you enjoy them. I hope that they bring you a little bit of joy, a little history, a little understanding of San Francisco, the city that is and was. And with that, what do I also do? I also do the This Week in Science podcast where we talk about science. Lots of science conversations on that. I have to get to editing that one. That's got to come out for this week's episode. And yeah, so I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are. I hope that you find the sunshine even though you're among the clouds, wherever. All right. Thank you. I will be back tomorrow, 3:00 for more story time. Tell your friends. Okay, bye. Thanks for watching.